everyone. This is the Agentic Quality Podcast, and I'm your host, Tatyana. I've been in quality for 20 plus years, and I've been leading quality engineering teams for half of that time. And AI is transforming our industry. It's the biggest transformation I've seen in my career. This is why I'm talking to engineering leaders about how they are using AI in their teams and how they're using it to transform their quality process. Today, I have Ravi Subramanian with me. He's an engineer at heart with nearly 25 years of experience in the industry. He's been building software systems and teams, and he has a lot of experience in mobile infrastructure and SDKs. And recently, he's been working in FinTech and embedded finance. I'm looking forward to have this conversation with him. Ravi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tatyana. Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, can you start with telling us a bit more about the teams, the products you worked on, and how was your journey in tech?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So, as you mentioned, thank you first of all for having me. This is super fun. I'm looking really forward to this conversation. I've been in technology for more years than I care to admit. 25 plus years. In fact, I began in quality. Years ago, I began as an SDET at Microsoft. I mean, I had a brief stint in a startup as a dev, but then actually began life as an SDET in the SQL Server team at Microsoft and cut my teeth writing test automation for like the SQL Server engine, which was fun times back in the day. And then I found myself drawn towards the act of writing the automation, and I remember writing like a SQL debugger for SQL Server using an interface that was built way back in the day. So that's kind of how I shifted over. Then I discovered a mobile opening, and that's sort of rest is history. So I worked in a lot of like mobile oriented products, typically the OS layer. And then in that same process, I worked kind of in smaller and smaller companies, startups and so on until I shifted into engineering leadership, also in mobile. And then more recently, I've actually pivoted hard left, if you will, into fintech. It's definitely an industry that's growing, continues to grow. I can, I can tell you both, experience working there as well as experience, seeking opportunities. I can, say that it's alive and well. So,
Yeah.
so I've been working in this area for a while, and so that's kind of how I've evolved. So I can talk to you a little bit about what I've worked on, if that helps.
Yeah, I was going to say, I started as an SDET at Microsoft as well. So we have a similar journey. And I
All
love
right.
talking to engineering leaders who start in quality and then end up as an engineering leaders because they understand both side of the puzzle, right? Perspectives of quality and the development. So love to dig into that. So tell us more about what kind of products you worked on and what makes it challenging for quality in fintech. You probably have a good perspective to compare, like fintech products with the big tech products or any other products. So what are the top challenges in fintech for quality?
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me, it was very illustrative because like from my perspective, almost like I said, my shift from mobile to fintech was fairly stark. So like the challenges are quite different. So just set some context just to kick it off, like for the benefit of folks that may not be very well versed. I thought I'll take a moment to define fintech itself, which I mean, I would call it as like the application of modern technology to the existing financial systems. The tech in fintech is sort of arguably misleading because tech has been in the financial space for decades now. And every bank that you've ever used, they use mainframes, credit cards. When you swipe a credit card, they've been using mainframes for decades now. So I would say fintech is sort of the application of modern tech, and so it's more like how the shift is, I would say, in how financial services are delivered rather than what services are offered. So it's a little bit about leveraging tech to reimagine, say, like financial services. For example, like I think the canonical example would be an app-based bank. So that's like the application of a modern technology that we now take for granted. Install an app from the app store, start like sharing money, sharing, doing transactions, paying, receiving money, etc. All of that, like we take it for granted now. But that layer of where arbitrary companies, Tatyana.com, can now be a bank, a virtual bank, and actually put out a service. So
Mhm.
that's what I would call fintech. And so, briefly, what did I work on? I worked on one of the large financial services companies that have been around for a long time, and they were pivoting into fintech as well because, as you probably know, in the last several years, there have been many, many strides here. And I would say Stripe is a good example of a company that's really made inroads there. So I worked on card issuance and servicing, so like payment services, creating so embedded finance was the team. As you can tell, that word means embedding financial abilities into products that are traditionally not financial. One interesting thing I learned is that I had never thought of it this way, but every company is a payments provider. And I was a little taken aback to when described that way, but that's true because ultimately every company is selling something.
Mm.
At some point, a
Yeah,
customer, whoever it is buying something.
yeah,
And at that point, they have to pay for it. How are they paying for it? How are you as the business receiving the money? Unless you have some sort of payment reception,
right.
it's not going to work. So and so that aspect, making that super smooth and simple and easy to do, is another angle of fintech and embedded. So I worked on like a pay by bank widget. You may have used this in some form as a customer yourself. I had previously, and so it's like a drop-in React component that you can put into your uh, product's webpage
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
where you can link to your bank, and then instead of paying with a credit card, you can pay through your bank account, and it's all seamless. And you, as Tatyana.com, in this hypothetical company, you don't have to know anything about fintech. It just works. So like
mm-hmm,
that's one of the products we worked on, and then I know another key area I worked on, which is fun and sort of little different, is also like the core money movement using what's called ACH. You may have seen this like three-letter acronym in a lot of
mm-hmm,
places. It
mm-hmm.
stands for Automated Clearinghouse. Um, it's a fascinating set of protocols and standards, and it's literally how money moves. Like you send $1
Mm.
from your bank to somebody else, it typically goes through
Yeah,
ACH
I
more
just
often than
I
not.
just use that for to pay for my roof replacement. It
There
went
you
through
go. Okay.
ACH.
Yes, and we'll get into some of those because, like, yeah, it's a very fascinating topic, and
Okay,
these are
so
the things that,
so
yeah,
payments, right? So I've
yeah,
heard
yeah,
stories about companies who use payment systems and how they're tested, and they're like, "Oh, we had to use these credit cards to test it for real," right? Like, because if you use a
yes.
mock, you don't know that it still works end to end. So you have to. So what are the challenges like that you faced?
That's a great segue. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges I would say in fintech. Like I said, especially coming from a space where I'm used to being able to mock this or mock that, and it's quite a different world. So at a high level, I would say there's a few buckets of areas. I would say like the top one that I would say really stuck with me is the compliance and regulations aspect. You may argue that that's sort of a thing with every space at one level or another. Like, for example, even if I'm a mobile product, there is a form of compliance where I have to make sure that I'm not collecting data from like minors, for example. There is a compliance thing there, but frankly, having worked in that industry long enough, that's not in the forefront of most people's minds when they're working on these products. Whereas when it comes to fintech, it's front and center. Like you cannot screw around because it's someone else's money, even if it's 1 cent. So, and so like compliance and regulations are like, it's a very heavily regulated industry, as you can imagine. And so that really complicates testing validation
Yeah, so
flows.
I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit. So is that what makes it harder for the AI to get adopted because of the compliance and regulation systems?
I would say that's definitely one angle. I mean, the way I see it, there's probably, as with everything else, some areas where AI will really help you accelerate testing and maybe even like open up avenues of testing that were not possible previously because it doesn't sleep. And I can have an army of like agents essentially going through the specifications, trying to like really kick the tires on because ACH has a good example. The spec is like, gosh, 600 pages in a PDF, like if you want to get it right. And I don't know how many implementations have gotten all of those specifications right. Now, what would be interesting is if and frankly, and you've been in the industry, so you probably know the challenge of like, resourcing a testing team to go to that level of detail. And so AI is actually a wonderful sort of like a tool, if you will. that you can use where you can basically have a bunch of agents looking through the code, because that's another thing they do now, right? They can look through your code base and identify, like do linting at the lowest level, but they can also jump in and find logic errors, or at least what they think are logic errors, um, as well as essentially correlate with the spec and make sure that all these corner cases are possibly uh, taken into account.
Yeah.
Obviously, with it will come, the other side of the coin is that there's a lot of nervousness around the use of AI, because you have to be correct and you cannot trust the output of an AI, because not just the hallucination part. I think people are starting to get accustomed to the fact that, okay, AI will sort of make things up by design, so we'll have to stay on top of it. But there's probably a knob as to how far you can go with allowing AI to go through, checking your code for you, and then let's say, actually something runs afoul of a compliance rule. Who's to blame here? Like, you have to take the blame. So you can't just say that the AI did it. Like, that doesn't work. So it's sort of uprooted the whole approach to compliance a little bit, I would say, that people are wondering. Like, there's, again, people who are very scared of engineers using AI for compliance, and others who are like very thrilled about using that to improve compliance checking. And there's obviously some reality checks as well, which I'll jump into later, which are just very hard to use AI for, at least at the way things are at the moment. But yeah, so there's definitely lots and lots of
And
ways
so
I can
when
think of.
when we have a protocol like that we implemented, right? Like 650 pages, it seems to me that's a good use of AI to just go and create the test for this kind of protocol for my implementation and make sure that I'm compliant with the protocol if that's an issue. So sounds like a good application here. But where do the most quality failures happen in fintech? And what is the cost of the mistake if something goes wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there are drops in quality and there are, like, total failures, right? I mean, correctness is probably a big place where a failure can hurt, because as I mentioned earlier, this being like fintech, where people's actual money is involved, it leads to um, so one of the common problems is, when it comes to a financial system that you're building, more often than not there is a ledger involved. And just at a high level, ledger, as you might imagine, is a system that is to a very deep level of detail recording every cent that's going in and out of the system, and everything that's pending, everything. It kind of captures all of that. And once you start throwing in millions of users or scale or concurrency and all of that, there's you start opening up possibilities of small amounts of changes and differences between what you think you have and what you actually have. And so that's called drift. And these types of failures they really hurt a lot in many ways. I mean, the kind of the obvious one is, you get something wrong like that, you lose trust with your customers, and your customers are kind of like, there's a chain of customers too. There are partners you work with. There's almost no fintech that can do the whole thing by themselves. They have to work with a bunch of partners. The biggest one being a bank called a sponsor bank. So there's their trust. There's, of course, the end user trust. There's regulatory body trust, and then there's like customers, who may be businesses and not the end users. So there's just a lot of trust in this whole pipeline, if you will. So
Mm.
that's probably a big thing that you lose. And then, as you asking about like cost of mistakes, gosh, like the ones we've seen, like technically I would say, like one or two things that keep coming up a lot is backfills, which tend to be the impact of most of the mistakes that happen. Like any issue with your code, like rolling back already moved money is not possible, right? So you kind of so if I already
That's
gave you an
right.
extra 2 cents, oops, like it may seem like nothing, but you got to get it right. So yeah, so it's not the same as another database entity. I wrote
It's
a
not.
wrong. Yeah,
So you have
exactly.
to be very confident in the code, right? So you have
100%.
to have confidence in the releases.
And so for
Like
backfills to work, if you work back from there, you need to make sure that you're logging and collecting everything that happened in the system so that you can
yeah,
replay it. So replayability is necessary. And
yeah.
then this is like this, and for other reasons, like the investigation cost of an issue itself can be like super high. Like a drift problem in a ledger, like a virtual ledger, those are hard to debug and they really eat up like engineer time.
Yeah, this is the next level, right? So I worked in the high stakes products, such as at VMware. I worked on Tanzu, which allows you to run software. So we would support like big customers like FedEx to run software on their machines in the offices and whatnot. And so if we break something, then basically their offices go down or their machines
Mm,
go down. So that's one level of responsibility. But when it comes to money, and the personal finances, like I feel like that's even higher stake in a way, especially if you impact more than one user. Like if the bug impacts millions of users, that's a lot of bad things that can happen out of that. So the stakes are definitely high when it comes to
indeed.
managing their finances. And so have you been exploring AI and how did you go about using AI in this space?
Yeah. I could touch on that, and if you don't mind, I'll actually there's a couple more like interesting areas that I wanted to call out as like challenges with fintech, if that's
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Go ahead.
So like I think that you touched upon this earlier, but like actually the environment setup and production testing itself is like a huge challenge because as you probably remember, like credit cards, now we've reached a point I think where like credit cards, you can have a fake credit card that actually has a fake credit number that is recognized within the system, but you can
Uh,
swipe it and kind of go through the whole flow,
okay.
except that no real money moves. So you can get away with certain level of testing with that. But like bank accounts, like how do you mock a bank? How do you mock a bank account? Is it even possible to have a staging environment that involves a bank? Because for money movement, you're literally talking ACH protocol to one bank that goes through the Federal Reserve, sometimes called the Fed, and then goes to another bank. Like,
Yeah.
how do you mock
Yeah.
that? Because
Yeah. How do you do that? I'm curious.
we didn't, to be honest with you. So actually, and that's actually very challenging because that's where I do think AI may have a role where for at least those are all I would say at this point, like have conjectures as to how it could work. It probably requires a bunch of investigation and R&D to sort of validate it. But like, banks don't want to do even like, you would think it's simple to say, hey, sponsor bank, could you please create this one special account? Let's call it the fake account, and we'll use that for all our testing so we can pay people with it. And they're like, no way, man. Like, banks, they want to do this because they don't want to come under scrutiny, like even like the smallest thing, it all falls on them. So what is the staging environment? Like that's like you can get up to the point where the money movement is initiated. And at that point, again, like you're screwed. Like you have to assume that it happened. That's it. And so,
Right.
there's a lot of, and so that sort of kind of dovetails with the fact that there's a lot of complex integrations. Like just to give you another example of EH money movement, different banks do different things, even though the spec is very clear on what needs to be done. Like when you initiate a transfer of the bank, one bank uses SFTP. One bank uses a REST API to initiate the transfer. Another bank uses emails to validate that at the end of the day is when they will actually tell you that, hey, this was the type of money movements that happened, and then we use that to reconcile at our end. So
Mm.
these things sort of complicate it. And then I didn't even touch upon fraud. That's a whole other thing. Like you as a customer, you just expect your stuff to work, and you get mad. And if they don't, and I get mad if like a dollar gets missed. But fintechs have to deal with, you know, all sorts of crazy things like under fraud. There's like common problems like I think there's one called check kiting where you send a check from you pay money to yourself between two banks, and it always takes about 2 days to settle the funds settlement. That's a whole other area of testing which is like very, very challenging because it
Yeah.
needs wall clock time.
Yeah.
And then in the time that you sent a check, you can then send a check from here back to yourself, and suddenly from $0 you have twice the amount of money, and you kind of quit
Mm.
before the fraud is discovered. And this is
Yeah.
an example that actually companies have figured out how to test
Mm.
for, but it's a cat and mouse game, as you know how fraud and security is. So
I'd love to
that's a
see how the AI exploratory testing can be applied here, right? Because we can
yes.
even ask it, like, hey, come up with the ways of how you could fraud the system.
That's actually a great point. And in fact, a lot of the fraud systems are sort of separate and have been evolving over time, even at the company I worked at, where we had a whole separate division that would kind of look back at years of transactions that are anonymized
Right.
with known fraud occurrences to sort of train the model to look for newer, similar, and other patterns. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
you're
So
right
it's
on the
not a
money
new
there.
idea. I know banks already use AI to recognize patterns in the transactions, right? And whatnot. So going back on how we're going to use AI to
Yeah.
test all of this. So have you done anything about it, or have you seen team doing that?
Yeah, so I'll caveat this a little bit by saying that a lot of these ideas are evolving, and our team tried a few, but not necessarily all of them yet. And then, as you know, AI is changing like a pretty rapid clip. So I think the most obvious one is like using them for code review, provided, you give it like a code quality checklist. And it sort of can do, auto bug fixing or finding, fixing, linting, especially the stuff that developers find to be potentially boring work. But now they're good enough even to find like off by one errors, like basic logic errors and stuff. So that's actually a really good way to find bugs that traditionally a quality team is where like this concept of the SDET, as you're familiar, we used to be SDET. So we were comfortable looking through code even if we didn't write the production code, right? So now, AIs can do that. So, as a side note, I feel like this whole notion of an estate is evolving now. Like what does an estate do? Like what is a quality engineer? I would love to hear your take on that. But that's where like AI sort of comes in, like so code review, and then obviously test generation. We talked about that. I think that's a cheap and easy. It almost kind of removes the excuse to get a head start on unit testing, especially it kind of forces you to go back to the days when we had to write down these test specs. And so now you can grant the test spec to an AI and it just sort of, blurts out tests, and they're getting better and better day by day. So that's another one we used it for. And then the spec-based test generation, like that's the one that we talked about, like where you handed a PDF, sort of ask it to churn through it and then kind of figure out, looking at the code to see what cases are actually covered and what cases are not. And so like ACH as an example, under the covers, there's all these weird cases that are very hard to test, but at least you can detect if your system will handle that. So I'll give you just a random example of like, you can actually go up to 60 days of a transaction that was completed where a customer can say, hey, by the way, this transaction was not something I authorized. So at the system level, a transaction, let's say T1, up to 60 days later, we could get a return code called R07, like user did not authorize transaction. Um, how do you simulate something like that, especially when you don't have access to mock banks and stuff? But at least at a minimum, because there's a giant like state flow diagram of like all the various places you can go in this ACH like mess, AI is a fantastic sort of helper there to kind of determine, if all these paths are covered and then like other paths are not yet covered. So like blind spot identification. So that's another one. A couple other ones, yeah, that come to mind that we didn't get around to yet is the data creation, like test data creation, especially helpful for fraud. Um, to to trend spotting. It's useful for anonymizing, yeah, past data to generate new transactions. Test maintenance, I think that's a good one. Every team I've been in, there's always a situation where a handful of tests are failing, and like the developers just go like, actually, this test is kind of old. I'm just going to mark it as skip and move on, and then
I know
instant
that.
tech debt, right? I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah,
And
the
so,
self-healing of the AI, right? And that we don't have to spend so much time now on troubleshooting and then fixing the tests. That's such a huge time saver. And
correct.
you talked about how the role of the SDET is changing. So my take on this is that it's very easy for AI now to do a simple functional testing. Give it an API, give it an UI, it can create the test plan for you, it can automate it for you. That can all be done. So I think that where SDETs are going to be more useful now is at the complex integrations. Like in this example, like you said, there are multiple complex integration between the bank and the finance website or whatnot. So there, it's hard for UI to understand, and there's no specifications to explain everything. So I think that's where the human would still be useful to do the work of SDET or strategy, or how do we test this, or what needs to be tested, writing that all down. So I think that the level of this that's going to get elevated, and we're going to start working on the harder problems that we used to, and the easier problems are going to be given to AI. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I think it's sort of the test disciplines or quality disciplines equivalent of what's happening to engineers, right? Because the base level for an engineer has gone from I'm just a junior engineer that graduated from college to like I'm already a somewhat, budding senior engineer that has access to a bunch of junior engineers, aka AIs. And so I'm directing them to do so. I'm starting off being a tech lead of sorts. So there's that. And then to your point, the ability to get a broader sort of view over the system. So it's less important that I know how to sit and write this large algorithm, in Rust or something. And it's more important that I understand what it does and I can ask the agent to write most of it if there's a spec for it. So I think it's sort of, I agree with you, sort of. I know a lot of companies have even given up on the role of SDET. Like every developer is also a tester now. Like I think Amazon sort of pioneered that around here. And I think every developer should be thinking about quality. But I also do agree that there should be people who think about quality as like their top priority, because I think frequently that gets sort of, I'm getting philosophical here, but I think frequently that sort of gets pushed to the side. And it's usually,
Yeah.
sometimes we say like UX is the first thing to get cut when resources are tough. I think like quality
Yeah.
also, people
Yeah.
just don't talk about it, also gets cut. But yeah, so I sort
Yeah.
of agree with you.
But look, I worked in the environments like Amazon. So when I worked at VMware, we also had developers doing functional testing and even some integration testing, and testers focused on the end-to-end testing. Here's the problem with this environment is that the teams are so big that people only know the service they're working on. So like in that case, there were 15 services and, 80 devs, and then each knew their own services. They didn't know how the other services work. And so they would miss these gaps of how these services integrate. And this is what happens at scale. Like when you have so many teams, there is no way for one engineer to understand the whole system. And someone has to look at it end to end. And that's usually the role of the, as that or end to end tester. So I think that's the best way to scale quality from what I've seen is that developers are focusing on functional testing of their own services, make sure that that works, but then have someone to look at it end to end and make sure that integration works. And so I think that role will still be there. We'll push left on developers, to do all of their functional testing with AI, but the end to end will still belong to someone to look at it.
I totally agree with that. And what's interesting is that at some level, I think it's some of the best quality people I've worked with always seem to have a much better understanding of the system than the engineers, even the best engineers.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I totally agree with you on
th-
that. And I think,
that's where the
uh,
value of testers, right?
yeah, 100%. Like, and then like that also gives them the ability to use AI differently. Where like, as you to your point, like if I'm using multiple agents, I'm not focused on like a sliver. I'm focused on like the larger picture, and then kind of exercising all of those different paths through the integration. Yeah, totally agree. And that
Yeah.
fintech is just rife with all sorts of integrations, if all kinds. So it's
Yeah.
impossible to
So
avoid
I
it.
think there
Yeah.
will still be a role for SDETs in fintech. So moving on, talking about the adoption of AI in companies. So have you seen what are the barriers to adoption? Why is it hard? Is it hard or is it easy adoption?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it sort of there's multiple layers to it. I think it depends on the industry, it depends on the company. And so in my experience, I feel like the industry has moved on very quickly, but whereas, in fintech and the financial services industry, by definition, they tend to move very deliberately. So in our case, even like I would say leadership buy-in was a challenge. It took a while, and primarily because, you know, uh, there was the initial lack of understanding, which I don't blame anybody for, right? Because I don't know if most, senior software engineers understood what these models were doing. I mean, for crying out loud, like the companies themselves didn't know what why their models were doing what they were doing, right? So I think the fear is not misplaced. So there's worry about like leakage of customer data, like algorithms. And, if I'm not in like a engineering role, if I just cut and paste some like the revenue data and ask the AI to process it, that I could be running off all of a law or a rule that I didn't even realize. So there's definitely a lot of pushback on that, and so ultimately we ended up making sure that we got enterprise agreements and like all tight, legally tight approach. And so it took a while. Uh, but I think to their credit, I mean, everybody realizes you cannot avoid it. So it's just, it takes a while. So I think the leadership buy-in is obviously going to be a challenge, and it'll continue to be a challenge, I think. And so I think a way to potentially address that is to make sure that the leadership teams themselves are being educated and educating themselves. I think that's a very, very
Yeah.
critical piece of this.
You faced any barriers on the ground, like from the
Y-
engineers themselves?
Yeah, 100%. I think this is changing, but like initially, I think the engineers, as I'm sure you've seen, I think there's a mix of like, uh, what the hell is this thing? It just makes mistakes and it's going to make my job worse or harder. And then there's a whole, oh crap, is this going to replace me?
Yep.
And they don't say
Yep.
that out loud. Yeah. And then the third thing is like yesterday's tool is already obsolete. Like, how do you adopt a tool and then like kind of include it in your workflow when things are actually changing like so rapidly? So there's a bunch of that. So I would say again, my take on that is like I would say we should ensure that there is durability in the selection of a tool. Like set aside some actually maybe a small team or a tiger team, whatever you want to call it, whose entire job it is to sort of figure this out, find a trusted engineer or two to kind of work on that, and then champion it. Because like I think tool sprawl is definitely a big one. And considering that we already have multiple integration points, and that's already cognitive load for like most engineers, just throwing in you know AI and all the things it does on top of that is just even worse. So like that's another thing that we wanted to watch out for, because like if you leave it to the engineering team, one person may like Claude Code, one person may like Gemini, and so I would say like standards are key there as well. So like
Yeah.
there's yeah, of course there are legal issues, which is sort of like is the reason why we got pushback. And frankly, the other challenge is training, which I can talk about as well. But I'm a big
Yeah.
believer in that. Like if you don't have structured training, again, it doesn't matter what sort of tool you adopt. The understanding and learning will diverge. It applies to everything, and so it also applies to AI, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And so, like you said, there's a sprawl of tools, and there's so many on the market right now, and we have to choose one. And so, what are some of the metrics that you've seen or you know of that we use to measure the success of adoption, right? And how do we choose the right tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be lying if I said I knew the exact answer. I think the space is evolving like so quickly. But there's a couple of the thoughts I have on that. I would say maybe we apply the same type of metrics we apply to human only teams, because at some level that's kind of what an AI is doing. So we have the traditional metrics we tend to look at. We have code coverage, we have test coverage, we have like the mean time to like defect resolution, mean time to deployment. So we can carefully assess if AI is helping or hurting there. I think like that's one way to look at it. But I think like NPS from the customer to see if like okay, if I don't, fintech may or may not apply directly to fintech, except maybe in embedded finance where there's like actual user experiences involved. But if our customers' NPS is going up because we are adopting AI, whether it's for customer support, testing, product development, then I think that's a good use. I think importantly, we need to make sure that it's not going in the other direction. Um, yeah, I think there's probably some new metrics that will need to be introduced. I think for me, like this cognitive load is an interesting one because my spidey sense always says like you bring in like a new tool. Yes, it's going to take some time for people to actually understand how to use it best. So it's going to slow down first. There's no question about it. But after that, does it go up and then cross over, or is it like just adding to the set of things that I'm already dealing with? Like just as a manager, I'm dealing with like Slack and Notion and email and like 100 tools already. You throw another one of this into the mix that everyone is saying you must use it. Yeah. So like what does that do to engineer like or team's productivity? I would say I'll just caution that that's a tough one. I don't know how yet to measure like a team's productivity outside of like so I would just go step by step of like just checking where this is actually hurting and where it's helping, and kind of staying on top of like the pulse from the engineers and giving it a little bit of time. Because I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of like, at least earlier on when AI was a thing, there's a lot of
Yeah,
pressure from like executive teams, like, hey, we're paying for AI now, let's move. Why are the teams not
yeah,
2x more productive now? So
yeah,
if
yeah,
only it were
yeah.
that simple.
Yeah, for sure. It takes time to adapt a new tool, and you can't just get the metrics right away. Like you said, you have to get used to
What have
it.
you seen? Yeah, I'm curious. Like, have you seen any interesting metrics from the quality front or otherwise?
I've heard conversations about measuring like how much code we write, right? And how many more like changes we're making and all of that for the developers. But at the end of the day, it all comes to rework that we have to do after we use the AI to write the code, right? So we do have to use end-to-end metrics rather than the how much code we produce, right? We have to use like lead time to change or how many production defects did we have to fix and how much time did it take, right? So we still have to kind of take into account the whole end-to-end picture of the developing the product and releasing it. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, these metrics are evolving. Like you said, I don't have the answer to which metrics, we should be using to say if it's working for us or not, for sure. And So, for quality leaders and engineering leaders who are listening right now, especially in the areas like finance, which is heavily regulated and high risk industries, so what do you think they can do today to start their journey with AI if they haven't yet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say to me, like philosophically, it's not super different than the adoption of like any new technology. This is a little special for sure, but I would say like maybe as a structured approach, I would say find a sponsor first. Like when a team is attempting to employ the cutting edge, let's say cursor sub agents, that's the thing that I want to adopt. Now, I would say it's probably as a leader, it's important for you to make sure that there's no pushback from executive leadership that'll invalidate all the investment. And depending on organizational culture, it may be that you need to go skunk works until you can prove value. So I think the larger the company, it's kind of easier it is for you to be able to have a little secret team to kind of figure things out. But at this point, I don't think there's any need for this to be secret because everyone's sort of expecting it to be used. So, but I would say just make sure that you have alignment. So, and then the next thing I would say is 100% is to find a champion like in your org, like at the in the ground, like a senior engineer that you trust. I call them like a measured enthusiasts.
Oh,
Somebody who wants to learn and has like best interests at heart. They don't poo poo everything. They're like, they really want to adopt the technology and not be very negative about it, and then involve the quality people ahead of time. Like I think you want champions when the quality people can, and the quality team can also help sort of make the push for, hey, here's what we think, and do some experiments, right? So I think that's the other thing, like, and the reason I said champion is like the other one is to invest in training. And after you have one or more people who sort of like really adopt it and they want it, I would say make sure the entire team is on board with the same tool and the same standards. Everybody works the same way. Is it agents? Is it Claude? Is it Gemini? Do we use Claude.md, agents.md, whatever it is? Every folder, every subfolder. Make sure everybody's aligned with the same standards of like how you generate, how much you generate, how you review, all of that. Because that way, then it sort of is a measured approach to getting effective, and we can like as a team move forward. Maybe the third and probably important to fintech, I would say, is like think about reducing the blast radius, unless until you can prove effectiveness. Start with some, maybe it's a space that either nobody wants to work on or like something that's internal or high impact, like logging or auditing. Auditing is like the stuff that everybody needs to do, but it's the thing that usually takes a backseat because who wants to sit and write like an audit tool? No PM is going to sign off on that unless like there's a customer saying, show me audit logs, otherwise I'm not going to sign. So, but this is a great place where you can attempt to use AI and sort of build something and show the value instantly. Uh, and it doesn't impact the end customer, but like it makes us better when it comes to quality issues and things like that. So that's the way I would say, like take baby steps like that. So have low expectations and
yeah.
give it some time.
I love
That's the
your
way I would put
third
it.
point, because we have so many tools or optimizations that we want to do a lot of times that are on the tech debt list. We're like, oh, we would love to do that, right? Or legacy platforms that no one wants to rewrite, right? So I would love to see the legacy platform, code to be updated through this. So thanks for all of that great advice. And Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to the role of the SDET, since you have some experience in that before. So, what skills do you think SDETs should be learning and should be focusing on right now to be successful in this AI era?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a meta skill is always going to be adaptable. Look at what's changing in the industry, embrace what's happening, and then sort of pick the things that make the most sense to you. Like, I think it's, unless I have used, say, again, I keep going back to the sub agents with cursors because I think that's a really cool new thing they've introduced. Let's say, if I haven't used it, it's too early for me to say this is not useful. Like, play with the tools, stay curious. In fact, almost for quality people, it's like the most important quality, right? Pun unintended. So, yeah, I think so. I think that's an important thing for SDETs. And then when I was an SDET, this was true, and I don't think this has changed, which is be comfortable looking into the details of code. Like, as I said before, I think it's important to know how the system works. And then breadth always helps because that just makes SDETs like invaluable because like I said, the best SDETs, developers used to go ask them questions. It was not the other way around. And so I would say like these are all true. And then maybe these roles, the titles may change. We had prompt engineer for a while as an actual role people were hiring for, which I think in retrospect feels silly, but like every engineer is sort of slowly shifting into part product manager, part tester, part engineering lead. And I think this is going to be true for like all of the roles. So I think, but the things I mentioned maybe apply a little bit more to say. I think like it feels like it's a silly thing to say, get good at prompting, but really what is that? It is thinking deeply through like what are the correct questions I can ask and what level of detail can I know and offer to the AI so that it does actually what I want instead of just saying, write the test and then sit back and see what happens, right? So like
Right.
the deeper you can give information to the AI, then it's like a superpower for an SDET to like
Yeah.
generate. Like one of my favorite SDETs of all time was this person at Microsoft. I remember this was in SQL Server. Uh, they ended up reading the TSQL like language spec for a bug bash, and they essentially generated SQL statements that adheres to the grammar and would
Uh,
basically generate all valid SQL statements and throw it at the database. And this
uh-huh.
was like a bug bash for the database. And
Yeah.
I think they found like 10 times more bugs than
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
second was so far, it was hilarious. Like
Yeah.
they found so many bugs. So like, and that was what that came to like, curiosity that came from, just, trying a different approach. So like staying open to just going deep. Like I think these are the skills that will
Yeah.
always be valuable. And I think they apply to quality folks as
I
well.
love the stories like that, when we can think about how to scale the approach of testing, not just how do I test it and what do I test, but how can I do this
Exactly.
efficiently in a short amount of time and find the most issues, right? So that's what I love about being in testing. And great advice. So, as dads, please stay curious, minded, adaptable, and learn prompt engineering. That's the advice from Ravi. And Ravi, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. I really appreciate that you educated us on challenges in finance, testing the finance products. I didn't know personally. I never worked in finance, so that was insightful for me to learn what are the challenges and how we can solve them with AI. So thank you for being there here. Where do people can find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for having me as well. I really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. It's you can probably put it in your show notes, but it's
Yep.
IN/RAVISU. And I also have a website that for myself now, which I vibe coded, which made it super easy to do. So it's ravisu.org, which is again just a link to my resume and a couple of things. I hope to improve the content on there
Yeah.
over time. But yeah, that's where you
So
can find me.
find Ravi on LinkedIn and on his website. We'll tag you in the post. Please subscribe to the Agentic Quality podcast to hear our future conversations. And thank you for being with us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tatyana. Yeah, thank
Bye.
you for doing this podcast. I think it's a fantastic idea. I love it. And yeah, all the best. Hope we get to chat some more in the future.
Yep.
This was
Thank
great.
you.